fire up?
Yeah, whenever you think we should start, why don't you go and introduce me and I'll fire it up.
Okay. And you can do the presentation, you've got that all set?
Yeah, we did. We ran it ahead of time. So I think we should be good.
Super, super. That's great. We'll wait a couple of minutes and see.
Sure.
I'm going to go through a little bit of housekeeping. Do you mind if we record this?
Not at all. Please do.
We're going to try to record it. Our IT guy, full-time and worker, treasurer, is a very busy guy, and George is, I'm not sure, he's going to try to record it, but we'll see if anything goes wacko, we'll be in trouble with the recording, but. Oh, look at the, hi Jackie, hi Carol, hi Kathy, hi Al, hi Deborah, hi Ike, Vermont Judy. Who are you, Judy? Pam. Lori's back. Great. Hi, Lori. And Ike is here. Oh, we've got a stellar group. Dave Thomas, hi Dave, hi Polly. Oh my gosh, look at all the old regulars. Hi guys.
Did you say old, Martha?
No, I did not.
Okay.
No, that was a mishearing.
Yep.
There isn't.
I'll be right
there's
back.
Brad. Hey, Brad.
Hey, Martha.
And Betsy, my gosh, this is fabulous. Do you want me, Tucker, to be looking at the chat, or can you can manage that yourself?
How I think I'll do the chat is that I'll come back at the end to answer the questions. I couldn't figure out how to share my screen as well as see the chat box going. But feel free to just interrupt me if something is pertinent to what I'm saying. I'm absolutely fine with that. So feel free to chime in.
Oops, something's happened with Judy. Okay. Well, I'm going to go through a little bit of housekeeping so we got ourselves on the same page. So good to see everybody. When we're talking, when someone else is talking or when Tucker's talking, please have your microphone muted. And that's just at the bottom of your screen where you just click on that little microphone icon. If you want to just see Tucker, you can pin Tucker. If you know what that means, just put your icon over his face and there's like a push pin. If you click that, it just makes his face much bigger and you will get shoved to the side. But when he's presenting, you want to unpin that so you can see his presentation. Like Tucker just said, if you have a question while he's presenting, please write it in the chat. And if we get through the end and you have questions, if you know about raising your hand, there's a little palm at the bottom of your screen so we can recognize you. So just click that little palm. I'm going to click it on my screen and you see the little hand go up and then just unclick it when you got your question answered. So it's being recorded, and if you don't want your face to be on a recording, you might want to turn off your camera, but you're all lovely, but so you stay right where you are. Don't anybody turn off their camera. So we have today Tucker Fultz from the Rokeby Museum, and I hope everyone's been down there. If not, I hope you do when the season opens next year. Tucker is the Education Programs Manager at the Rokeby Museum, and we are so happy to have you here today, Tucker. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Martha. Thanks for the introduction. And this is the first in a series of 3 talks that Roku is going to be doing for you all. And so I'm sure Martha has sent out the details about that, but this will be the first. And then while I have this up, we have another talk happening on Monday, December 6th, same time. And that's going to be about the commercial art of Rachel Robinson Elmer, and that'll be done by Lindsay Varner, who is the director at Rokeby. And then I will be back again on January 12th, same time again, as you all know, and that is called the Weird and Wonderful Collection at Rokeby Museum. So we'll really be zeroing in on the collection. And this talk today is all about the history of abolition at Rokeby Museum and in Greater Vermont, and about the Underground Railroad, what activity was happening in Ferrisburg and elsewhere. So as Martha said, if you have any questions, throw them in the chat and I'll get to them at the end. And like you probably heard, Martha can interrupt me if there's a kind of pertinent question that we want to ask as we're going, but I don't mind going back to any of the content that I shared with you. So before I share my screen, I want to do an introduction to the General Underground Railroad and some introductions to General Rokeby. If you haven't been to Rokeby before, we're located in Ferrisburg, Vermont. We'll be opening for the season in May, every weekend in May, and then on Memorial Day weekend, we'll be opening for the whole season, all the way until October. So we close to the public generally in the wintertime, but we do continue our programming for education. So we have groups that come, adult groups and children groups that come throughout the winter as well. My job at Rokeby is manyfold, but one of them is the education programs that we do, and that involves adult education as well. So things like this, which we're very excited to do. To go over kind of Underground Railroad History 101, we always do this at the beginning of our programs because a lot of Underground Railroad history has been mistaught, unfortunately. It's one of the, I would say, most misremembered events in American history. But it is this very important story for Americans, one of strength and resistance in this dark time of our history, and one that Americans understandably attach themselves a lot to. But because of that, and because of some of the things that we'll talk about, there are so many myths that have sort of shrouded the truth of what really happened. Most of these originated in the 20th century. And as an Underground Railroad History Museum, it's part of our job to kind of unpack some of those myths. So what's the challenge with Underground Railroad history? You might, some of it might be obvious, but, because the Underground Railroad was happening in secret, there's a problem with the sources. There's very few sources about the Underground Railroad because so much of it was unwritten. Rokeby is actually unique because we have some of the best well-documented cases on the Underground Railroad. We're one of the best documented cases in the country. And so that's special. So we are able to tell quite a few stories. And really that has a lot to do with how unique Vermont is in the history of the Underground Railroad, which we'll get into as we go. So the records are lacking because of this aspect of secrecy, because there were bounty hunters, because there were wanted ads out, of course, succeeding on the Underground Railroad, making your way out of the South and out of the southern northern states into a place that was a little bit safer was very hard. Also, there were anti-literacy laws. And so in the South, there were 7 different states that held anti-literacy laws, specifically prohibiting Black people from reading or writing, or the teaching of it. In the North, though, as well, Black students were mostly barred from public schools. And because of this, first-person records on the Underground Railroad are very few and far between. There's one law that's important to know in the history of the Underground Railroad. It's the Fugitive Slave Act, which was passed in 1850. This is a federal law, so across the country, and it allowed enslavers to come into free states and capture former property and bring them back into enslavement. This was a big back step in all of the laws that were being passed in the North towards abolition, state by state. But it also meant that people that were helping freedom seekers could be sentenced to 6 months in prison, and it was a $1,000 fine. So at this point, a lot of records actually were destroyed. that people that were helping on the Underground Railroad had, because they didn't want to be legally involved in anything. So that's another reason why so many records ceased to exist after 1850. And that's actually the case at Rokeby as well. So we don't have any record of any freedom seekers coming to Rokeby after 1850. Of course, it's the full, decade before the Civil War. We don't know if there was any activity that happened after that point. But there were other reasons that pointed to the reason why the Robinsons might have stopped helping on the Underground Railroad. The main reason being that they left Quaker religion at the exact same time. So their connections to agents on the Underground Railroad further to the south were severed at that time too. But it doesn't mean it didn't happen. We just don't know. So back to the sort of uneven historic record thing. So all these holes exist in the historic record of the Underground Railroad, and it's not just because of the secrecy aspect, but also because of the larger trend in history. And that is that those in the past with wealth and power left a greater historic record than those with less money, and in the United States, people of color. So this is true, of all civilizations. This is true in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in ancient China. The history of the rich and powerful, there's so much more historic documentation, so we can tell such richer stories about those that were in power. Furthermore, in preservation, historically more effort has been made to preserve the history of the rich, and in the United States, of the rich and white. And so you could compare this to, say the house of a president compared to the cabins of those that they enslaved. Historians today are fighting to counter this unbalance and trying to read between the lines to reveal, more stories, richer stories of those that were less fortunate. At Rokeby, the same imbalance in the historic record also exists in our historic record. So Rokeby Museum has preserved about 15,000 letters, as well as account books, diaries, receipts, photographs, textiles, furniture, art, other items that help tell this story of this rich, deep story of this 4 generations of families that lived at Rokeby Farm, the Robinson family. So you're able to paint this detailed picture of their lives, of their personalities, of the things that they owned, of their likes and dislikes. We can't tell the same stories of the freedom seekers that came through Rokeby. The freedom seekers that came through Rokeby, they had less agency in their lives. The home that they stayed at was not their home. It was a home that they were passing through, and that home got preserved by later generations of Robinsons, mostly to preserve the history of their own family, white family's history. So the mentions that we do have of freedom seekers at Rokeby, they come in these fleeting mentions in Robinson letters and diaries. They aren't the main subject of the records that we have. They are, mentions between when we'll go over some of them, but when people were coming to Rokeby, also just brief mentions of people and that came through, someone that in a letter that they wrote to someone else, or in a journal entry, so-and-so did this, or so-and-so was here this night. They're all very, very brief, but despite that, it is a much richer and more detailed history than a lot of other Underground Railroad sites. And so we are able to tell some amazing stories that we'll go through today. Okay, now I want to dispel a few sort of common myths about the Underground Railroad. And I want to start with the numbers. So in the mid-1800s, there were about 4 million enslaved people in the United States. 4 million, that's what historians have sort of guesstimated. And they've also guessed that roughly 600,000 to 100,000 people escaped on the Underground Railroad. So successfully escaped to the north. So it's a very large number, but it's a very small percentage of the people that were enslaved. Pathways. When you're thinking about the Underground Railroad, if you think about people's pathways north and south, some people actually were headed south to maroon communities in Haiti, in Mexico, but the majority of people were headed north, as we know. If you think about it more like a web or a network rather than these linear paths, because we actually know now that most freedom seekers used a different path than most anyone else that was escaping on the Underground Railroad. There weren't these same tracks that everyone went. The Underground Railroad was much more random than people generally remember it to be and less organized than people remember it to be. You'll see the freedom seekers that came to Rokeby, they all met someone who knew Rowland Robinson, and that's why they ended up there. You didn't get on the train and then you just met the next person, that's what the other freedom seeker did before you. And then regional differences. We're going to focus a lot on this to kind of bring out why Vermont was a little bit different, why the story's a little bit different in Vermont than it was and in other states further to the south. But during our tour, I hope that you come to an understanding of these sort of regional differences to bring out this more nuanced story of the Underground Railroad than what we generally believe it to be as one, as the exact same system across the country. Another thing that kind of relates to that is a lot of people believe that the Underground Railroad existed in the South. It really didn't exist in the South. It was really once freedom seekers got to the North, got to free states when they had assistance and had this more organized fashion. Freedom seekers were generally on their own when they were in the South. So there's also this other one that's very important for Rokeby, which is this white savior narrative. And this was really came out in the 20th century, really early 20th century. This was sort of being formulated. And that's the myth that the Underground Railroad was run by white Quakers. Well, Quakers like the Robinsons were very involved. It did play a large working role in abolition. This benevolent white Quaker story is generally a falsehood. It's overshadowed the work of Black abolitionists. The Underground Railroad was majority run by free Black Northerners. And enslaved Americans, fought for their own freedom against these unimaginable odds, and then turned around to help others do the same thing. The famous people being Harriet Tubman or Frederick Douglass or William Still. And then we're going to go into some names that you probably don't know on the tour. So why all the myths? So, of course, it's missing all these pieces. It has all these holes. And so people have kind of filled them in to try to make it make more sense, make it feel like a more easy to understand, easy to explain story. But also there's this other side to it, that at times these explanations and these tall tales have exaggerated the efforts of white people, and oftentimes they suppress the memory of Black individuals and replace them with these uplifting stories of white benevolence. There's a lot of other falsehoods about the Underground Railroad. I'm not going to go into all of them, but as you go out into the world and you read more about this and you hear about them, come at it with a critical mind. Don't trust sort of everything you hear, and make sure you kind of do your research before kind of repeating it. Okay, so another quick thing I want to go over before I'll share my screen is just the language that you hear me use during this tour. So you might hear me using words that you've heard before or haven't heard before, but we're very intentional in the words that we use and we explain why. So instead of saying slave, I'll say enslaved. And the reason for that is when you say slave, it's like their only identity, their only chance for identity was to be enslaved in that name. When you say enslaved, it's one of the things that was happening to them in their lives, but there was many other things that these individuals were as well. Individuals just like you and I with their likes and dislikes and separate lives. So the same sort of thing when we say, instead of saying master or owner, we say enslaver. So it's the same kind of idea, but you flip it on its head. And so when you say master or owner, there's this power dynamic that exists in that name. And of course, that power dynamic existed at the time, but there's no room to kind of question that power dynamic. When you say enslaver, baked into that word is the fact that these people were waking up every single day and they were deciding to enslave another individual. So as we look back on them in history, if we put that at the forefront of our mind of how we're thinking about them, it has kind of a powerful impact. And then the last one is instead of saying fugitive, we say refugee or freedom seeker. You'll hear me say refugee or freedom seeker. So for the history of all of the Underground Railroad, freedom seekers were called fugitives. Of course, fugitive brings to mind a criminal, someone that's broken the law, someone that's evading the law. It even has this image that's kind of associated with it. Of course, these individuals, they had broken federal laws. So, technically they're fugitives, but as we look back on history, we know we don't want to judge them by the laws of their time because we know that the laws were wrong. So if we look back at them, what's a better word that we can use to describe them? a refugee, the definition of that, a refugee is someone who escapes their home because their home is unsafe. So it feels like a much better word to use for these individuals. And then freedom seeker is straightforward, someone that's seeking their own freedom. So as you go into the world, today, if you want, we ask questions and things, I encourage you to try out these words. I slip up all the time. The other words are part of our lexicon. They're what we learned, we grew up with. And the most important thing is just to recognize that the words that we use to describe people in the past have this really powerful impact on the way that we think about them and maybe even value them. And so if we could change that a little bit, we might start looking at history a little bit differently. Okay, so thank you for bearing with me for that long introduction. I'm going to share my screen now, and we'll get into some of the stories. Sorry, folks, 1 second. Okay. So I've lost seeing myself on there, but if anything looks weird, just jump in, Martha, and let me know. Okay. So here we are, Free and Safe. This is the name of our permanent exhibit about the Underground Railroad at Rokeby. And so we're going to use the exhibit as kind of a template to tell some of these stories. I want to bring you through some images of the outside of Rokeby Museum. So this is the historic house here. Rokeby Museum was home to 4 generations of the Robinson family from 1793 to 1961. The site consists of 90 acres of trails, old farm buildings, some old farm property, and thousands of artifacts, a modern education building, and a store or gift shop with our permanent exhibit and a seasonal exhibit space. Here you see the back of the historic house. And if you can see my cursor here, this section right here is the original portion of the house that was here in the 1790s when Thomas Robinson purchased the property from the Dakin family. If you know Dakin Farm, that family was around back then as well. And so he purchased about 1,000 acres, and this little part of the house was here. In the 1810s, they added on this larger section in the front, much grander rooms. The family was pulling in a lot more money from the merino sheep trade at that point. So higher ceilings, a wood stove in every single room in that section of the house. In the 1890s, they added, where my cursor there is, they added this last section right here. And that was actually the clerk's office for Ferrisburgh. And so 3 generations of the Robinson family were town clerks. And so all of the town records were kept at Rokeby until the 1960s, which is kind of funny. So people would come to Rokeby with their grievances and all that sort of thing. Here you see the same view, but a little bit more backed up. And I'm just waiting for my cursor to show up, it's disappear. But over on the left side there, you see that wooden building, 2-story building with a chimney. That's called the other house. That was housing for seasonal staff at Rokeby, staff that was working on the farm seasonally. It was built sometime between the 1820s and 1830s, the same period when a lot of the freedom seekers were coming through Rokeby. And so this is one of the buildings that freedom seekers were actually staying in. The other buildings that you see here are other outbuildings. In the center, there is a smokehouse. To the right side, the red building there is the chicken coop. Okay. So Rowland, Thomas Robinson, and Rachel Robinson, this is the second generation that was living at Rokeby. And they are the generation that we're really going to zero in on when we're talking about the history, because this was the generation that was housing people on the Underground Railroad. So our history does span in all sorts of different directions. We have a lot of rich history about abolition, as well as art and agriculture and other themes. But for this tour, we're really centered in on this generation here. Okay. So Rowland and Rachel were Quakers. In short, Quakerism was founded on the four guiding principles of stillness and silence, community, simplicity, and equality. They believed that anyone can speak directly with God, and a priest or minister was not necessary, although some did have, some meetings had them. So everyone, to Quakers, everyone has an inner light, and sometimes this is called God. Sometimes this is just referred to as sort of the goodness within everyone. The Robinsons' anti-slavery beliefs were directly tied up in their religious understandings of the world. So it's very important to see their abolition through the lens of their religion. Every person, contained an inner light. So to hold another person in slavery was a sin against God. However, Quakers were not always anti-slavery. So the earliest Quaker anti-slavery Quaker petition came out of a Germantown meeting in 1688, but it took a very long time. It took about over 100 more years before the Quakers denounced slavery. So a lot of colonial Quakers in America were enslavers. And but by 1774, all Quaker meetings had concluded that slave owning was incompatible with membership. And so we know actually that Rowland's ancestors were enslavers in Newport, Rhode Island. Before they came to Vermont, they were enslavers. Their home that they built there had included slave quarters, and they actually were financially involved in the transatlantic slave trade. They either owned ships or were captains of ships in the transatlantic slave trade, so very involved, and it's different depending on which generation we're talking about. So by the time Rowland and Rachel were being brought up, though, Quakers had denounced slavery. And Quakers had become one of the earliest and most active religious groups that were working towards the ending of slavery. Rachel and Rowland themselves became radical abolitionists, and they were also religious perfectionists, and that played out in a lot of different ways in their lives. They were unflinching in their commitment that all enslaved individuals must be immediately emancipated. And that was a controversial topic at the time. Most Americans that believed in abolition believed that it should be gradual emancipation, which is how it happened and how it happened in most states in the North, including Vermont. So they were friends and followers of William Lloyd Garrison, and Rowland was sometimes a contributor to Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. And then at Rokeby, Rowland and Rachel, of course, provided work and shelter to refugees on the Underground Railroad. But besides assisting those in the Underground Railroad, they boycotted all slave-made goods on the property, something that was pretty hard to do in the United States at that time. It meant that they had to make a lot of things on the property themselves, grow and make a lot of things. They also operated a radical interracial school on the property, and they funded and organized the sharing of anti-slavery literature to Vermont libraries. Rowland was involved with anti-slavery work on a national and on local levels. He helped organize the Ferrisburg Anti-Slavery Society, the town of Ferrisburg where we're located. He also was a founding member of the Vermont Anti-Slavery Society, which was the first in the country. And he was the chairman of the executive committee in that society. And he was a Vermont delegate for the American Anti-Slavery Society. In 1834, Robinson helped host the Great Convention, which was a convention that sent Frederick Douglass as a special speaker to 100 cities across the northern United States. And so he hosted Frederick Douglass here in Ferrisburg. Douglass at that time, he came up and he spoke in Middlebury and in Ferrisburg. Let's see, get the next there. Douglass. And he noted that when he was in Middlebury, he had a really poor reception. He was heckled by crowds, he was jeered by people, and Middlebury College students, they flyered the town with anti-Frederick Douglass flyers, really saying, what is he doing here? Why is he here? In Ferrisburg, he had the opposite reception. He was very warmly received. It just really shows how different communities in Vermont were at the time regarding anti-slavery. You know, Ferrisburg is just up the road from Middlebury, but Douglas had this very different reception when he came to Ferrisburg, as reported by Douglas. Okay, so at the same exact time period that we're talking about, the 1830s, the era that we're really going to focus on, 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s a little bit. But that's the most active time for folks on the Underground Railroad coming through Vermont. There was this huge rise in popularity of abolition in Vermont. It didn't mean that majority of Vermonters believed or were working on it, but it was quite popular as compared to other states. By 1837, Vermonters had organized 90 abolition societies with 10,000 members. At the time, the population of the state was 290,000. So a pretty large percentage of Vermonters were at least going to these meetings. Over on the right here, this is the State Anti-Slavery Society Convention invitation with Rowland's name at the bottom there. So now I want to turn to particular stories about Rokeby that have to do with particular freedom seekers that came through. So our permanent exhibit, Free and Safe, it has to do, it really focuses in on the stories of two freedom seekers. One was Simon and one was Jesse. These are the two freedom seekers that we know the most about. We can tell the best stories about at Rokeby. Now, we don't have any direct documentation, no primary sources from Simon or Jesse, as is typical with the Underground Railroad. So everything we know about Simon comes from letters that were sent from two white men, from a man named Oliver Johnson, who was a friend of Robinson's. And he's from Peachum. He was also a Vermonter. He was working as an agent on the Underground Railroad in the northern states to the south of Vermont that were still free states. So he was writing letters back and forth to Robinson. So this means that our perception of Simon is always filtered through the lens of these two privileged white men, Johnson and Robinson. And so as historians, we always need to be aware of and kind of unpack that filter as we go. But what we can do and what we did with this exhibit to kind of fill in the story of Simon and bring out a clearer picture of where his decisions might have come from was to contextualize Simon's journey within what was happening in the places that he moved with in terms of abolition and freedom seekers and the Underground Railroad. So we started in Maryland. So we know from the letters that Simon was enslaved in Maryland. This image on the left here of enslaved tobacco cultivators in Maryland, we kind of have to start there because Maryland's earliest cash crop was tobacco. And the majority of enslaved individuals were working on tobacco farms. But by the 1830s, Maryland had really depleted a lot of its soil. Tobacco really steals a lot of the nutrients out of soil. And so they had to switch their main crop. And so they switched over to wheat production for the most part. Wheat production. And so enslavers, so with wheat production, you have a shorter harvest season. So enslavers suddenly had this excess of enslaved individuals on their farms. And so this brought about something that you might have heard of before, the Second Middle Passage. And so what happened is that enslaved people were sent from these mid-Atlantic large farms and sent down into the deep south. And so cotton was on the rise at the time, the sort of classic image that many people have of slavery in the United States, big cotton plantations. The cotton gin was invented, and that was really on the rise. So, so to go back to Simon for a second, so that's to set up, what was happening in Maryland at this time when he escaped. To go back to Simon for a second, in the letter, they mentioned what kind of skills he had as a farmer. And that included cradling and pitching and plowing. All those things are what you would do on a wheat farm. And so it seems like Simon was enslaved doing that sort of work, working on a wheat farm. I also said in the letter that he had been sold to a sole driver for $1,000, along with a few other enslaved individuals at the time when he escaped. And so we know that freedom seekers often escaped at times when they were being resold. And so there was a changing of hands, and in the confusion of that, people would sometimes slip away. But also, if Simon was planning to escape, enslaved people probably or might have heard of the Second Middle Passage, even though it didn't have a name at this point. This horrible journey where people were marched 2 by 2 from the Mid-Atlantic all the way into the Deep South. And he might have had a sense of, where he was in the United States, despite not having been taught to read or write, likely. And knowing that he would be sent further to the South might have made an escape at that time. So why did he escape when he did? We said that oftentimes freedom seekers would escape during the time of a sale, but also we actually know the time of year that he escaped. So he shows up in this town of Jenner, Pennsylvania, in January, the very beginning of January. And it says in the letter that he escaped in December. And so looking at what's happening, at this time of year, at the end of December, that's right around the time of Christmas. And a lot of freedom seekers did escape during Christmas time. It was this period where enslavers and overseers had their eyes turned away. They would be, there would be part of the celebrations that were happening, and there wasn't as much of a watchful eye. And so at that time, people would slip away as well. Simon went to Jenner, Pennsylvania, and he stayed there for the winter. So Jenner, Pennsylvania is just over the border from Maryland. It's very close to the state that he was enslaved in. And he stayed there for the winter. And then what was happening in this letter was Oliver Johnson was introducing Robinson to Simon, telling him about this man that he met. And he was also saying, I'd like to arrange for him to go to your farm, if you agree, to work once the spring comes, once the thaw comes. So the time of year might have really helped him out because bounty hunters' work generally stopped in the wintertime because it was so much harder to move around. And so Simon hid out at this farm in Jenner, Pennsylvania, and then as soon as the thaw happened, he took off. So based on what we know, the primary reason why Simon came to Rokeby was for employment, to make money. Although we can't hear from Simon in his own words, we can kind of make these educated guesses as to why he made these decisions based on timing and factors and time of year and what was going on with enslavement in this area at the time. But I want to move on to the motivations for bringing Simon to Rokeby from the white individuals, from Robinson himself. So one was his safety. They wrote about in his letters, they wanted to get him to a safer location. One was his character. They said, he appeared to be an honest, likely man. I was so pleased with his appearance and the account given to him by Griffith, the man who met Simon, who he was staying with in Jenner, that I could not help but thinking he would be a good man for you to hire. Mr. Griffith says he is of a kind disposition. So there's his character. They're talking about what kind of a guy Simon is, what he would be like as an employee. And then they focused in on his skills as a worker. They spent the majority of the time when they were talking about Simon in this letter, talking about his skills as a worker. They actually quoted his selling price. That's how I know that he was sold for $1,000 along with a few other individuals. They quoted his selling price on the selling block as a factor of how good he would be as a worker. It says, he says he was sold with several others to a sole driver for $1,000. Consequently, he must have been considered very valuable. So we can conclude that, typically freedom seekers weren't coming to Rokeby simply as guests. They were coming to Rokeby to work, to make money, to get on their feet for the first time, start to make an income, which would give them a lot more agency in their lives. But for Rowland Robinson, hosting freedom seekers was a symbiotic relationship. Rowland and Rachel, they had a need for workers. They had this large farm operation and they had very small families. They always had need for people working and they always hired people seasonally. They had a lot of people that came on seasonally. Not just freedom seekers, but also migrant workers that came down from Quebec, and then just other local Vermonters, black and white, were working seasonally too. But also his Quaker Underground agent friends like Johnson, they were trying to match the skills of these people that they met, these freedom seekers, with the work that was needed at Rokeby. And this is seen in other letters that we have between him and other agents on the Underground Railroad, or Johnson again in another letter for another person. So for freedom seekers, Rokeby offered this employment, this space, this time to start a new life. And also, like the rest of the country, Vermonters were discriminating against Black individuals in employment at this time. So Vermont mill owners and farm owners were more likely to hire poor white people than skilled Black laborers. And so at Rokeby, we have a place where in Vermont where they can be hired, they can, start to make an income. However, we have to ask ourselves, who benefited the most from this financial exchange? Of course, it was Robinson. Of course, it was the owner of the property, the most privileged person in the relationship. In fact, Robinson is, benefiting from skills that Simon learned while he was enslaved. But Simon also knows this when he meets Griffith and Johnson, the two white men that met him in Jeddah, Pennsylvania. He immediately tells them how good he is at the things that he knows how to do in terms of farming. A quote from the letter: "Mr. Griffith says that he is of a kind disposition and knows how to do almost kinds of farm work. He is used to teaming. He is very good to manage horses. He says that he could beat any man in the neighborhood where he lived in Maryland at mowing, cradling, or pitching." Again, how we know that he knew how to work on wheat farms. So while the majority of freedom seekers that were employed at Rokeby were not all refugees, there is at least, excuse me, let me start again. So all of the freedom seekers that came to Rokeby, they weren't all working. We have a few instances of people that did just come for one night. There's this one sort of interesting story where these two men fled, this is another quote, fled bondage in a whaleboat and were pursued by an American vessel of war. These men were anxious to get to Canada, and grief sat heavy on their hearts, having left their wives behind. That was a letter between Rachel and her friend Anne King, talking about these two freedom seekers that just came through one night, and the next day Robinson drove them to the ferry up to Canada. So not everyone was working, but the majority of freedom seekers that came to Rokeby were staying there for long periods of time, months at a time, and working. Okay. Here we see some pictures of Rowland and Oliver Johnson. So Oliver Johnson, the man from Peacham who was making the contact with Simon. This sketch right here is a sketch from RER, Rowland Evans Robinson. Evans Robinson was the son of Rowland and Rachel, and he became a quite well-known folklorist and artist. And so we have all these sketches that he made of his childhood when he grew up at Rokeby. Here you see a racially diverse workforce at Rokeby. They're washing the sheep here. So again, we don't have any images of freedom seekers that came through Rokeby, unfortunately, any photographs of freedom seekers. We have things like this. So this, we don't know that this was necessarily a freedom seeker that he's trying to depict here. It might have just been a Black Vermonter that was working at Rokeby, since it was a place that employed Black Vermonters at the time, but it shows the racially diverse workforce. And I want to use this image to jump off and talk about what we know about the wider free Black community outside of Rokeby in Vermont at this time. So not all persons of color that worked at Rokeby, as we said, were freedom seekers. There were other Vermonters that worked for Black Vermonters that worked for long periods at Rokeby. Most noted is Mingo Niles and his wife. Mingo Niles actually worked at Rokeby for 30 years, and he had been born enslaved in Rhode Island, and he had come to Vermont, and it seems like he was manumitted in Rhode Island and came to Vermont, made his way somehow to Rokeby, and was working for the Robinsons for a long period of time. One of his main jobs was he was the head of the family garden, so the garden that was really supplying most of the food to the family and the workers. So there actually was a significant free Black community in this part of the Lake Champlain region, the Ferrisburgh area at the time. Some area towns actually had larger Black populations then than they do today. And so, for example, Virgins was 7% African American in 1790. Ferrisburgh was 2.5 in 1800. These percentages were really watered down over time as poorer whites moved into Vermont in larger numbers. But many Black Vermonters had been enslaved in close by New England states like Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York. And they either immigrated after being manumitted, like what seems to have happened with Mingo Niles, or they escaped and settled in Vermont, or they manumitted when their enslavers moved to Vermont. And they were legally required to manumit their enslaved property, those people being new free Vermonters. But many Black families came to Vermont and they stayed for generations. There was a significant community that you may have heard of 8 different families in Heinsberg. It's referred to as the Hill community. Some wonderful research done by Elise Guyette, a historian Elise Guyette, on that community. Like the Robinsons, and that's nearby, that's just one town away from where we are. Like the Robinsons, these families, they also cleared the old growth forest. They raised merino sheep, just like the Robinsons did. Whereas the Robinsons were part of this elite class, owners of grist mills, owners of large amounts of property. For the majority of the Black Vermonters that were settling, these Black pioneer Vermonters in Vermont, they were part of the largest class of Vermonters at that time, which was minor landowners, kind of modest farmers at the time. But overall, Vermont's population of Black Vermonters was very small. Most free Black people in New England chose to live in cities. They concentrated in urban communities. The urban communities offered anonymity. It offered buffer against day-to-day white hostility. And it also offered community support. You could build community support where you couldn't in other places. Unlike the Hill, Black Vermonters, though, were often isolated from each other. So unlike that Hill community in Heinsberg, where 8 families really settled in this one area, most of the time Black Vermonters reported as being felt very isolated and really at the mercy of their white neighbors, whether their white neighbors were welcoming or not. And white Vermonters had the same racist sentiments that everyone else had in the country at that time, unfortunately. There's plenty of historic documentation of discrimination in Vermont, plenty of court records of Black families being targeted, including pulling out fences, destroying crops, burning hay ricks, killing their animals, spreading slander and lies. Many Black Vermont families had to move around a lot, unfortunately. So while many white Vermonters exhibited the same racist notions, there was still this mirroring idea that a lot of Vermonters also believed in abolition, compared to other places in the United States. These two things were existing at the same time. So what did Vermont offer Black individuals coming to the state in the early 1800s? It offered different laws than most of the rest of New England. So in Vermont at this time, early 1800s, interracial marriage was legal. The public schools were integrated. Some church congregations were welcoming to Black individuals, even putting them into positions of power, namely the Baptist churches. And Black male landowners could vote as well, could go into town meetings and vote. This is very different than what was happening in the rest of New England, in cities, in other states. But despite that, free Blacks were not moving en masse to Vermont. There was not this mass migration of people into the state. So there were significant pros, there were significant cons to starting a life in Vermont for free Black Americans at the time. Individuals seemed to, make decisions based on their own reasons, even though Vermont had these more tolerant laws. It was not attracting a large amount of numbers. Okay, so I want to share another story. Let's see where my time is. Okay, great. I want to share another story about Jesse. Jesse was another freedom seeker that came to Rokeby, and he was at Rokeby the exact same time period as Simon was. He was here in 1837. And so his story provides a really interesting story. I want to share a little, we call it an actorless play. And I'm going to share a video of the exhibit that you would visit, a part of the exhibit that you would visit at Rokeby. And you're going to hear the story from other letters about Jesse trying to negotiate with his former enslaver in North Carolina to buy his own papers, to make himself a free person. So he does this negotiation through Rowland. Rowland writes the letters for him and sends them back and forth to Ephraim. And so we'll see that Rowland has trouble because Jesse asks him to pay for some of these funds, and Rowland is against his religious principles. So we see this kind of dilemma that happens, but it's a pretty unique story. So I want to play this video. I'm just going to stop sharing for a quick moment. I'll stop the video a little bit early because it's a long one, and I'll just describe kind of what happens at the end to make sure we have enough time. Okay. If you have headphones nearby, I suggest maybe putting them in. I noticed that it sounded a lot better with headphones. Here we go.
Rokeby Farm, Ferrisburg, Vermont, May 3rd, 1837. Mingo, a longtime employee, speaks first. Then Jesse, a fugitive slave from Perkins County, North Carolina.
Come on, Jesse. Let's go get our breakfast. How long you been around here now?
Almost exactly 1 year, Mingo. What about you?
Lordy, I've been a Robinson relation for almost 30 years.
And when did you get free?
When I became a man. My master set me free, and I'll be a free man ever since. I'll be almost 60 now.
Woo! You're an old man, Mingo. I'll be heading that way too. Both those ways. I'll get old on my own, but free I got to work at. Mr. Robinson and I wrote a letter to my master in North Carolina about a month ago, offering him $150 for my freedom. Ooh, that's what I've saved since I've been here. And I heard that Mr. Robinson got a letter yesterday from North Carolina. I'm hoping that today we can read that letter. That's why today's a special day for me, Mingo. Today's the day I'm going to start to be free man. This whole past year I've been waiting for this day, Mingo. Today I'm going to start being free, Mingo. A free man. Just like you and Mr. Robinson.
Ah, Jesse, that sounds good. Morning, Mr. Robinson.
I was wondering, Mr. Robinson, after we all have our breakfast, I was wondering if we could read the letter I heard you got yesterday from North Carolina.
My goodness, News travels fast. Why don't we retire to my study and read the letter right now?
Good. I wanted to tell you, Mr. Robinson, how grateful I am to you for all y'all have done for me. I mean, let me stay here this past year, paying for my labor, teaching me how to read and write. I'm grateful. I'm forever in your debt. You are a kindly man, sir.
And I'm grateful for your thanks, Jesse, but you needn't thank me. You earned the money with your own skill and diligence, and saved it as well with your frugality and thrift. All virtues admirable in any man.
Thank you, sir.
What I have done is the right thing to do. It is what our Heavenly Father asks of all of us, and I would do it for anyone.
But you did it for me.
As I would for anyone in your predicament.
Yes, sir.
But I do thank you for your kind words, Jesse.
Yes, sir.
Shall we read the letter now?
Yes, sir.
Clemens County, North Carolina, April 19th, 1837, to Robert T. Robertson.
He got your name wrong.
He did. Your letter of 12th March is before me in regard to my Negro Jesse. His situation at this time places it in his power.
Give me what he thinks is proper. But I do not feel disposed to make any title for him for less than $300, which is not more than 1/3 what I could have had for him before he absconded if I had been disposed to sell him. But I have never had any such intention. I should like for him to return to North Carolina. He may be assured that I will not sell him. But I cannot expect it, as he, at this time, is entirely out of my reach and may not wish to place himself in my power again. I never intended that he should remain a slave longer than 3 or 4 years from the time he left. Jesse is a man that I had great regard for. I am in hopes he will do well. I should like to hear from him from time to time. If he should be disposed to give me the above sum, he can forward the money to someone with instructions to take a bill of sale. Respectfully, your friend, Ephraim Elliott.
I know this must be a disappointment to you.
Truly.
Early this morning, I composed my response to the letter from Mr. Elliott. I hope you will hear me out as I read it to you. Thy letter of the 19th was received, and I regret to find that the sum thou requires for the freedom of Jesse places this desirable object, the most anxious wish of his heart, beyond his reach. Since leaving thy service, he has, by his industry and economy, laid up $150, and he is wishing to give the whole of this sum for his freedom. The whole of his savings is all that he can offer. For much as I and his other friends here may desire his liberty, I am bound to inform thee, without the least wish to offend, that we cannot consciously contribute anything toward the purchase of a slave, even for his liberation, because we believe it would be recognizing a principle which God forbids. If Jesse was in possession of a larger sum, he would freely offer it all for his freedom. I therefore hope thou wilt consider the case of one for whom thou hast so great a regard, and accept his offer, which, considering his present circumstances and location, must be acknowledged liberal. Please inform me soon of thy mind in this case, and accept my own and Jesse's sincere desire for thy prosperity and happiness. Thy friend, Rowland T. Robinson. With all due.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing there just so we have a little more time. And share with you what happens at the end of the story. So these are letters going back and forth between Elliott Ephraim, this enslaver in North Carolina, and Robinson. We have both the letters, which is really interesting. So Ephraim writes back saying that he won't accept $150. He wants $300. And Jesse asks Rowland if he will pay the extra $150, if he'll loan him the money. And then he can pay him back, and Rowland refuses because it goes against his principles, as you saw there. And Jesse leaves. He leaves Rokeby at that time. He goes off the record completely. So we can infer that he might have been really unhappy about the outcome of that. Rowland wouldn't help him out in this way. And for Rowland, it's a religious principle. You know, the Quakers have decided upon, and they're steadfast in their principles. So if you give any money to an enslaver, you are perpetuating slavery, and so they're very strict about that. But what happens is 4 months after this exchange, Rowland, he in a meeting minute that we found, he edits that rule, and so he says that for their meeting, it's okay for Quakers to give money to enslavers if they are immediately emancipating someone. So after Jesse has left, it seems to have kind of changed his mind about this whole entire exchange. So sort of just an interesting story that we have here, where Jesse's trying to fight for his own agency, and decides to leave Rokeby when he doesn't when he isn't helped. Let me share my screen again. Okay, here we go. So I want to bring us inside the house for the end of this talk, and I want to bring us upstairs to a room that we know that the freedom seekers were sleeping in. So we know that they were staying in that other house, that building that I pointed out at the beginning, but we also know that they were sleeping inside the home as well. And so where we are right now is the front entrance of the house, just as you come inside, and you can see the staircase over to our right. We're going to go up the stairs, and there's the stairs in front of us. We just walked up the stairs there, and we're on this landing that goes into all of the bedrooms. And right in front of us, that door that's open a little ways, are what's called the upper kitchen chambers. And so it was in these two rooms. There's one room that leads to another room. It was in these two rooms that freedom seekers were sleeping. This is inside of the first room here. Well, it doesn't matter, but I think it's the east kitchen chamber. So, and you can see in the background there, see, there's my cursor, another doorway. So this leads into another room in the back. And I'm describing, all the physicality of these rooms because throughout the history of visitors coming to Rokeby Museum all the way up until the 1990s, that back room there was referred to as the slave room. And so I want to kind of unpack that, where that came from, because it really goes against the history that I've been telling you this whole time. So we're going to go back into that room. Here we are inside of this room. So we do know, this was one of the rooms that the freedom seekers were staying at. But when visitors came to Rokeby, they were told that this is where the freedom seekers were hiding. They were hiding up in this room, and you can imagine it because there's one room that kind of leads to another room. It's a little bit hidden in the house. You can't get to this back room in any other way except for going through that door in the back of this bedroom. And it was an exciting story for visitors, and told by the tour guides at Rokeby. It aligned with the stories that they were expecting. It aligned with these stories of the freedom seeker that is always in hot pursuit. And here they have to be hiding in this back hidden chamber before moving on into Canada. As Rokeby professionalized and historians went into the records, we found in the records the complete negation of that story. We found that no, actually, freedom seekers were out in the fields. They were working while they were here at Rokeby. They were staying for long periods of time, and they were staying in these rooms upstairs, and they were eating with the family downstairs in the kitchen, along with the other workers every night. They were very much a part of the working farm at Rokeby. And it aligns more with what historians have found about Vermont. And that is that there's no historic record of any bounty hunters actually coming into Vermont. Vermont is so far north that it will cost so much for an enslaver to send a bounty hunter all the way this far north to try to capture their former property. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, but there has been no historic record found of that happening. Also, these sites on the Underground Railroad were generally known to the authorities, to the newspapers. They were written about openly. You can tell from those letters that Robinson was writing about Jesse to the enslaver in North Carolina. He writes the first letter. He completely gives away the location of Jesse because Ephraim had to write back the letter to Rokeby Farm. And Ephraim says that Jesse is completely out of his reach when he's up in Vermont. It shows that Vermont is a little bit of a different place, a little bit farther away. And again, when they're getting here, they're not hiding. They're able to work, get on their feet, be employed just like anybody else. Most of the freedom seekers probably were headed to Canada. Most freedom seekers, that was the way that they were going, because in 1834, Canada passes a law that bans enslavement in all of their colonies, of which Canada was one at the time of England. And so because the laws are different, that's often where people were headed, but not everyone. And people really settled where they had connections and such. So now when people come to Rokeby, they hear this nuanced story of the Underground Railroad. They hear this story of work, of employment, of getting on their feet, rather than the slave room where people were hiding. But we still like to share that story because it shows how history changes over time as people look into the records and as new perspectives take an eye at the same resources that were there before. And of course, that story was part of this white savior narrative. How it came about, the slave room story, was that RER, that man that drew the pictures, the son of the abolitionist generation, he was a folklorist, and he wrote these folk stories about his childhood, and he wrote that story that was very popular at the time. He wrote stories about these brave white Quakers that were outwitting the cops at the time and saving these Black individuals, really the heroes of the story. And a historian took that story for fact. Even though it was a folk story, he took that story for fact. We have letters exchanged back and forth to the same historian from RER saying that he doesn't remember people hiding, saying that he knows that what he remembers is that people were working when they were at the farm. But then he was profiting off of this idea that that white Northerners especially really wanted to hear at the time in the early 1900s, these really popular stories of white savior narratives on the Underground Railroad. And so he was cashing in on that. And I'm writing these stories about this. His book about this came out of bondage, is called In 1900. So we want to kind of unpack those stories and share that as one of the sort of main stories that you'd hear about the Underground Railroad when you came to Rokeby. So I want to end on what happened to Simon and Jesse. Sadly, we don't know what happened to Simon and Jesse. Simon likely wasn't even his real name. In the letters, it's in quotation marks, because that was probably a false name that he was using for his own protection. But it's likely that they went to Canada, but we don't know for sure. One interesting thing that we know, like I said, was that both of them were here in 1837. So they probably knew each other. And it just kills me to not be able to hear those conversations that were happening between the two of them. They had so much in common. Did they become friends? Did they keep contact after they left Rokeby? Did they share their experiences on the Underground Railroad? Did they help each other when they were at Rokeby? So we know that Simon, Jesse, and the Robinsons, they made these choices in their life to resist these unjust power structures in their time. Jesse and Simon, they took unimaginable risks for their own emancipation. And the Robinsons themselves, they had wealth and they had connections and they had white privilege, and they used that status to fight unjust laws and assist the freedom seekers through employment and through housing. The Robinsons, and I really want to stress this, they were very, very unique for their time. Most white Northerners were ambivalent as to what to do about the ending of slavery. Slavery had existed by the ending of slavery, by the Emancipation Proclamation. It existed in this area for 400 years. Most white people decided not to do anything and to turn a blind eye. It was the system. It was how everything worked. How little were they? What could they do? And decided to not actively help freedom seekers, not actively work against the ending of slavery. And the Robinsons themselves were seen as rabble-rousers. They were seen as fundamentalists and a little bit crazy for their time. So as you go out into the world, I want to ask you to think about, how you can be a doer and not a bystander. How can you help those with less power by sharing the advantages you have been given? So I'll end there. Here's another image of the sleeping quarters. So he was kind of looking at the desk and looking at the bed here. And thank you all so much for coming. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen here. And I know I went a little over on time. Do we have time for any questions?
Yes, we've got a couple of questions from the chat.
Wonderful.
One you kind of answered you did answer in your presentation, but I have a question so the question was, did the freedom seekers get paid at Rokeby, which of course they did. Did they get equal pay?
That's something that we haven't been able to figure out. I've gotten that question a lot, understandably, and it's something that kind of kills me. I'd like to find. We don't have the different pay per like white versus black on the record, but we know that Robinson advocated for equal pay in a mill, I think it was, that was local. There was a connection, actually this connection with the Heinsberg community. There was a man there that asked Robinson to be a voice for equal pay at this time period. So we know that he was a supporter of it, but I don't have like the proof in the pudding, you could say.
And the other question from the chat is, what is a Quaker perfectionist? How?
Yeah, so absolutely. So that has to do with that they, kind of how they live their lives. So they created this whole world around themselves. So they, they boycotted these slave-made goods on the property, and that meant that they had to forge and make a lot more things on the property. They had to grow most everything that was being eaten, which isn't that different from Vermont or other Vermonters at the time, subsistence farming. But they also made the door handles and the hinges and things like that. And then they supported these free stores that were popping up, and there was one in New York City that they were involved with, where these stores were getting things, mostly internationally, things like coffee and sugar and cotton, and that were not from made by enslaved hands. And so it cost more. It's kind of like organic. Also, the quality they reported as not being as good. There's problems with the quality of these items. But the Robinsons decided to sort of use their wallets in that way. And then they built this school. That was like another branch of their perfectionism. They built this school that was founded in these principles that they wanted, and it was Quaker principles, but it wasn't a Quaker school. Non-Quakers could go there, and the education was really run by the interest of the students themselves, almost like Montessori type, we could put it as. And so they really lived by their ideals, you could say, and they were unflinching in those. So in that way, they were perfection. The Robinsons were part of the Hicksville Quakers, and so they were like this break-off that happened in the Quaker religion, and they were more fundamentalist, going back to the founding principles of 17th century Quakerism. And so they believed that the Quaker religion had gotten too involved in the capitalist system, too involved also with ministers, having too much power in the Quaker meetings. And so it was this breakoff sort of thing. So they were also seen, that side of Quakerism, as more of the radicals as well, interrupting meetings about abolition, things like that, believing that their emancipation needed to happen immediately, and also that there needed to be support for people of color after they were emancipated in terms of housing and jobs and employment.
Betsy Hardy has a question, has her hand raised. You want to unmute, Betsy?
Thank you. So I missed a little bit at the very beginning. You may have already answered this question. I'm just wondering if it's being taped, if it can be made available to any others who aren't with us today.
We hope so. We hope it was completed. We'll see. The attempt was made.
It's an excellent program. Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy. Other questions? Anybody want to raise a hand and ask a question? Or just shout out? Looks like that's it, Tucker. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us. And again, feedback there. And like I said, we'll be back again soon, talking about other aspects of rugby history. Thank you so much for sharing the afternoon with me.
Thank you. See you
All right.
later. Bye-bye.
Bye.